Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, I decided to do something a little bit different and a whole lot lighter than what we normally do. This week I'm going to be telling you about a kid who remembers his past life because there are so many cases that seem unbelievable, but this case is probably the most credible one that I know of. So this week we're covering the case of James Leininger, who remembered being a World War II pilot in his past life. So, without further ado, let's get it. James was born to his parents, Andrea and Bruce, on April 10th, 1998. So this was before the craze of everybody being interested in the paranormal and ghost stories and things like that just weren't as sensationalized back then in 1998 like they are today. But when James was about 2 years old, he got really into airplanes, and he wouldn't play with anything else. James's mom, Andrea, said that if you came in and looked around their house, that all you would see were, like, toy airplanes, aircraft carriers, and helicopters. They were James's favorite thing to look at, talk about, and he was way more into airplanes than just your average, 2-year-old who goes through, a year-long phase of being into trucks or trains or planes. James was absolutely obsessed with airplanes. He loved them. And at one point, Andrea remembered seeing a toy plane, and she was like, "Oh, look how cool, James. This plane has a bomb on the bottom of it." And James was quick to correct her, telling her that that wasn't actually a bomb on the bottom of the plane, that it was a drop tank. And for reference, I'm 30 years old right now, and I have absolutely no idea what the difference between a bomb and a drop tank is. So this has to say something about James's knowledge of planes, even as a toddler. And James would correct his parents about plane parts and, what all the parts did. And again, he's correcting his adult parents as a 2-year-old. Now, James's parents have been asked, and they've said that time and time again that there's no kind of, aviation or military background with anybody in their family or their extended family. So it wasn't like James was exposed to all this talk and, hearing people talk about planes or war or the military all the time. There was nothing that he could have picked up on or heard about in his day-to-day life that would explain James having this much knowledge about aviation in general. So when James was about 2 years old, his dad, Bruce, decided that he wanted to take James to the aviation museum called the Cavanaugh Flight Museum. Bruce knew that James would absolutely freak to see the life-size planes that were on display there. And when Bruce and James got there, Bruce was kind of expecting James to run through and just kind of look at all the planes for a minute, like most toddlers would do. Toddlers have the attention span of a flea, so normally they don't stay focused on one thing for very long. But while Bruce and James were there walking around the museum, James was drawn straight to the World War II plane exhibits. And he was absolutely in heaven. James stayed in that same section of the World War II planes for hours. He did not want to check out any other planes from any other era. He wasn't interested in looking at any other aircrafts. And after they'd already been at the museum for quite a few hours, Bruce told James, it's time to go. And James was absolutely not having it. He wanted to stay with the World War II planes, and he wasn't ready to leave. And just the mere thought of Bruce making James leave sent little James into a toddler-style meltdown. The only thing that Bruce was able to do to calm James down was to get him to agree to leave, and he just bribed him. He bribed him with a movie on a videotape about Blue Angels, and I had no idea what that was, so I looked it up. And Blue Angels were a Navy flight demonstration group, and the Blue Angels were formed after World War II. So once James got the tape, he watched it constantly. This tape to James was what Miss Rachel or Coco Melon is to toddlers today. He would watch it over and over and over again, and he absolutely loved it. But right after James turned 2, he started having extremely scary and vivid nightmares. And Andrea would go in to wake him up to try to comfort him, and these weren't your average, kids' night terrors. James would remember these dreams, and they were really starting to scare him. Andrea would always go in and calm him down to wake him up after, from his dream, and James would always be laying flat on his back and, kicking his feet in the air, completely terrified. And when Adrian would ask James what his bad dream had been about, he would tell her that airplane crashed on fire and little man can't get out. So Adrian asked James what had happened in his dream, and James was having this same nightmare almost every night. James said that in this bad dream, he would always be inside of an airplane, and that the plane would crash, and after it crashed, the plane would catch on fire with James in it. And as a parent, I can only imagine how helpless Andrea and Bruce had to feel. Their son's having this awful nightmare almost every single night, like 4 to 6 days a week on some weeks. And they don't know why, and there's really nothing that they can do to stop it. So like most people, they talk to their friends and family about James having this same dream all the time and wondering what might be causing it. And it was actually James's grandma, so Andrea's mom, that was the first one to throw out the idea that maybe James was remembering a past life experience. James's grandma suggested that they start asking James questions, but without leading him on as far as the answers go. But James' dad, Bruce, was super religious in his Christian beliefs, and I guess if you're a Christian, you don't believe in past lives or reincarnation or something, or at least that's what I gathered. I'm really not sure. But Bruce was positive that James was not a reincarnation and that he didn't want any part of it. But later on that same year, Bruce took James back to the Aviation Museum again. And again, James stayed right with the World War II era planes. But this time while they were there, James wasn't as excited as he had been the first time. He was a lot more quiet and reserved, and he really didn't say much. James just kind of walked around and admired the planes in awe of them. But, Bruce really wasn't sure why James wasn't as excited this time because he was still infatuated with the planes. Nothing had changed. But it was somewhere around this same time that James would take the propellers off of his toy planes, and when he was playing with his planes, he would always make 2 of the planes crash into each other like super hard. James did and said other things that most 2-year-olds wouldn't do or say. Like when he would play with his G.I. Joe characters, James gave all of his G.I. Joe's names, and he'd named them like Billy, Walter, and Leon. And both of James's parents couldn't figure out why he would have picked those older types of names. Like, they didn't know anybody with those same names. And finally, Bruce just asked, how did you come up with those 3 names and why did you choose them? And James told his dad that Billy, Walter, and Leon had been the 3 men that he'd met in heaven when he first got there. But Andrea was more worried about trying to figure out how to stop the nightmares and how to help her son. So she took her mom's advice and she started asking James questions without leading him on as far as answers. So when James would have this same dream, Andrea started asking him to kind of explain what was happening in this dream. And she tried to get him to walk through the dream step by step in more detail and in the exact same way that it had happened in his dream. James told Andrea that the plane that he was on a boat and that the plane took off from the boat and into the air. But then James said that once the plane was in the air that it had been shot and that the plane crashed and caught on fire. And Andrea was pretty confused, so she was just kind of okay, James, but who shot the plane down? And James gave his mom the most confused look, and he almost looked at her like this was something that she should have known already. But he told her that the Japanese were the ones that shot the plane down. And he told her he was kind of annoyed that she didn't know this already. Almost like he was saying, duh, who else would it have been besides the Japanese? So Andrea and Bruce asked James how he knew that, it had been the Japanese that had shot his plane down. And James told him that he had seen the symbol of the big red sun on the plane. And of course, as we all know, the Japan flag is white with a huge red circle in the middle. And to a 2-year-old, I'm sure that it looks like a big red sun, because mind you, James is still 2 or 3 at this point. But he shouldn't know about Japanese shooting planes down and shit, and how does he even know what the Japanese flag looks like? I'm not sure. But I did look up pictures of World War II era Japanese fighter pilots, and they actually did have the quote-unquote big red sun on them. So he wasn't wrong. But how did he know that? Bruce and Andrea kept trying to pry and ask questions, so, then they would ask James, okay, so the plane got shot down by the Japanese and it crashed and caught on fire, but who was driving the plane? Who was the pilot? And James told his parents that James was the one that had been driving the plane, that James was the pilot for the plane. And at first, Andrea and Bruce kind of thought that maybe James was a little bit confused. Like, maybe he thought that since he was the one having the dream, that meant that he was, using his own name in place of the person who was flying the plane. And Andrea and Bruce just thought that James was confused by the question, so they tried to reword it a little bit. So this time they asked him what his name had been while he was on the plane. And again, he told them that his name had been James. And they're both like, no, you're James now. And James insisted that his name had still been James while he was on the plane when it crashed and got shot down by the Japanese. So they let that question go because they thought that they were just confusing him by asking him what his name had been, like he's still a toddler. But they did try to get as much information out of James as they possibly could. Andrea and Bruce asked if James remembered what kind of plane it had been, that had been shot down and crashed. And James told him that he was the pilot of the plane called a Corsair. And then James told him that the Corsair planes, the tires would always go flat. And he would tell him about how the Corsair would always tilt and veer to the left. And how that caused it to be a little tricky to land, whatever. And I'm just like, holy shit. Because I looked up some of the World War II era Corsair plane recalls, like the manufacturer, like flaws. And I just have to say, like, toddler James hit this on the head. The Corsair planes that were used in World War II did tilt and make it harder for the plane to land. The tires going flat, like everything James says was listed on that website. Now, Andrea and Bruce had never heard of this type of plane before, but of course they weren't as into planes as James was either. But when they looked it up, a Corsair was a real plane, and it was a plane that was used in World War II. And this is their toddler telling all of these grown adults information about a plane and its quirks. Like, this reminds me of when we were all teenagers and we all drove hoopties for cars, and like if somebody else was about to drive our car somewhere, we would have to tell them stuff like the back window sticks, so don't roll it down. Oh, and sometimes the gear shifter skips drive and you have to move it a few times until it sticks, and you have to pump the brakes 3 times before the car starts slowing down. Like, I feel like this is what James is explaining about his plane to his parents. Like, he's like, the tires go flat really easy, and, it tilts to this side, and that, throws the balance off and makes it really hard to land, and, like, it's just, how else would he know that? I don't understand. Like, there's no logical reason that he would know that. And then Andrea remembered that James said that he had taken off in the plane on a boat. So she asked James if he remembered the name of the boat that he had been, that the plane had been on when he had taken off. And James just kind of answered pretty matter-of-factly and told her that he had been on Natoma. So when Andrea and Bruce looked into this boat name, after they were done talking to James, they figured out that there was a boat called the USS Natoma, and that it was an aircraft carrier, so planes would have been taken off from this boat, just like James said he'd done. Andrea asked James if he could remember any of his friends that he'd flown with back then, and James told her that he remembered flying with his good buddy Jack Larson. Now, James's parents would later find out that the Natoma was in the Pacific Ocean during World War II, and it was there for planes to take off on. Now, Bruce thought all of this stuff was kind of just a coincidence, that, he was only really looking into any of this stuff that James was saying to kind of prove that it wasn't true. And then one day, James's dad, Bruce, was looking at a book for one of his history book clubs, and the book was about the 1945 Battle of Iwo Jima. And James came over, and he was sitting on his dad's lap watching TV, and he just happened to look down at the book with Bruce, and on one of the pages, there was a picture of an aerial overview of the island where they had a lot of bases set up in World War II. And James pointed to a spot on the picture, and he tells his dad, like, this is where my plane was shot down. It was shot down right here. Which is completely insane, especially with how young James was when all this was happening. Like, what kind of toddler knows what even Iwo Jima is? I did not know what that was until this week when I was doing this case. Like, kids have a good imagination, but not that damn good. And they don't have that good of a vocabulary for that matter. So, Bruce started to notice that every picture that James was drawing, he would always draw planes crashing or a plane with a hole in the engine or, a plane on fire with somebody in it. Like, he was always recreating this dream that he was having. But at the bottom of the pictures that he would draw, James would always sign at the bottom as James 3. And he'd always done this, and I guess they just thought it was kind of like his thing. Until they started finding out all this other stuff about the boat, the plane, James supposedly being a pilot. So finally one day, Bruce just asked James, why do you sign it at the bottom as James 3? And James told his dad that he did that because he was the third James. I'm sorry, what does that even mean? I would be absolutely dead if my kids said any of this. I don't know how they did it. Andrea and Bruce say that James only watched Barney the dinosaur and Teletubbies, that they'd never talked about World War II or any kind of planes or aircrafts, so they had no idea, where James would have been coming up with this stuff from. And every time James would draw one of these pictures of a plane, somebody would ask, oh, what kind of plane is that you drew? And James would always say that it was either a Wildcat or a Corsair. And when he was asked about the Japanese planes, he would always refer to them as either a Betty or a Zeke. And finally, one day somebody was just like, why do you always call the Japanese planes that? And James told him that the boy planes were the ones that were used for the fight. Those were the ones that fought were the boy planes. And the girl planes were the ones that were in charge of bombing different areas. And I got way too into this case, and I looked that up also. Just because I'm not good at history, so I've never even heard of these phrases in this context before. But James was right. What I found was that they would always give a male name to the Japanese fighter planes and a female name to the planes that were responsible for dropping bombs, and that they were often referred to as Bettys or Zekes. How crazy is this shit? This blew my mind. And by this point, Bruce was pretty much convinced that, James had lived an entirely different life before he got to them, especially after he'd pointed out the place where his plane had been shot down in some random book with no one prompting him or asking him a question about it. He was still a little on the fence, but he's getting there. So now Bruce is just on a mission to try to find anything to be able to definitively say that James had been on a plane in World War II. So he hopped on his dial-up computer and he found a website called Natoma Bay Association. And this was just a site for people who had been on the USS Natoma Bay. And on this site, Bruce got in touch with a man named Leo. And Leo had also served in World War II. Or I guess around the same place and area or squadron that they believed James to be in. And Bruce just asked Leo if he remembered there ever being any Corsair airplanes on the Natoma Bay. And Bruce just kind of asked Leo if he remembered there ever being any Corsair airplanes on the Natoma Bay. And Leo was like, no, not that I remember. Leo told Bruce that he only ever remembered there being Wildcats and Avenger planes on the Natoma. Now, of course, Bruce hadn't mentioned James or his past lives or the possibility of reincarnation or anything else like that to Leo at this point. He just made it sound like he was a curious person looking for answers about World War II. So now Bruce is trying to get some kind of location out of Lee. So Bruce asked Leo if they'd ever had a mission near Iwo Jima. And Leo was like, hell yeah, we did. And Leo tells Bruce that he had actually been a part of 36 different missions there. And Bruce was thinking okay, I wonder if he knows any Jack Larsons. That, James said that was the guy that he'd flown with. So Bruce brings it up. And he asked Leo about a man named Jack Larson. And, he asked if he did know a Jack Larson that had ever been on the Natoma Bay. And lo and behold, Leo was like, yeah, I definitely knew Jack Larson. And then out of nowhere, like magic, Leo also tells Bruce that he had also remembered another young man by the name of James Houston Jr. And James Houston Jr. had also been on the Natoma Bay with Jack Larson. And that James Houston Jr. had been a fighter pilot during the war, and that James's plane had been shot down in Chichijima, Japan. He also told him that James Houston Jr. had been the only pilot that had been killed in Iwo Jima. But Leo said that he didn't really remember what had ever happened to Jack Larson, though. And he said that the last time that he'd seen Jack Larson, he had just flown off of Natama. I'm probably screwing all these names up. I had to even write them phonetically so I could, pronounce them as I say them. So all of this is kind of clicking. It's all pretty much making perfect sense because James had always said that he had been a fighter pilot in the war and he had been able to, out of thin air, pull the correct information about the Natama Bay out of nowhere. James had also been right about where his plane had been shot down and about who had shot his plane down. And he had always told his parents that his name was still James. And I think that they just kind of thought that James was confused because his name was James now. They hadn't really realized that James had also been his name before when he was in World War II as a fighter pilot. And James had also known the exact name Jack Larson. Down to the last name, he was able to give that before Bruce ever got in touch with Leo. And they had already been able to corroborate that Jack Larson was on the Natama with James Houston Jr., and since James Houston Jr. was the second James, then that would explain why little James always signed his name as James III, and why he would always tell his parents that he signed his drawings like that because he was the third James. How does a 2-year-old know all of this different stuff if it didn't happen to them? There's not really another explanation that makes any sense. But let's get back to it. Since Leo hadn't seen Jack Larson since he'd last taken off of the Natama Bay, Bruce needed to find Jack. But that turned into a harder task than what he thought it would be. Bruce couldn't find any records about Jack Larson, and he couldn't track down what had actually happened to him. But in September of 2002, when James would have been about 4 years old, Bruce attended a Natama Bay Association reunion where he was able to confirm that Jack Larson was actually a real person and that he had been on the Natama Bay with James Houston Jr. And then Bruce found out that Jack Larson was still alive and living in Springfield, Arkansas. So James's parents, Andrea and Bruce, were finally able to get in touch with Jack Larson. And when they did, Jack told Andrea and Bruce that he and James Houston Jr. had been best friends and that he'd actually been James Houston Jr.'s wingman on the day that James's plane was shot down. Jack Larson was able to tell Andrea and Bruce that James Houston Jr. had dealt with enemy fire and that his plane had been shot down by the Japanese, that James never returned after that, and that he was eventually declared MIA or missing in action. They were also able to track down a man that had been flying a separate airplane right beside of James Houston Jr. on the day that he died. And this man was able to confirm that the plane had been shot down in the exact same way that little James had always described. He was also able to confirm that the plane had been hit in the exact same spot that little James had always said. It was also able to be confirmed that the plane had taken off and been shot down in the exact same spot and in the exact same way that little James said, and in the same exact place that he'd pointed out in the book on the map. So after finding all of this out, Bruce started using the new information that he had to do a little more digging to see what else he could find out about James Houston Jr. And Bruce was able to find that James Houston Jr.'s plane had been shot down and that he had been killed when he was only 21 years old. And all of this was finally enough to make a full-blown believer out of James's dad, Bruce. I mean, how much can you really deny something when it all matches up so perfectly to what this kid's been saying the entire time? And it's not like little James's story kept changing or getting more extreme or dramatic or anything like that. His retelling of what happened and how he was killed and where it happened at had always been the same. Bruce actually believed little James's story so much now that he'd gone so far as to try to track down some of James Houston Jr.'s family members. And he was able to get in touch with James's sister named Ann. And Ann lived in California. And once Ann heard this unbelievable kind of story, she was curious to say the least. and she wanted to talk to little James for herself. So when little James and Ann got on the phone with each other and James told Ann some things that she knew that James shouldn't have known, like when she introduced herself as Ann, little James corrected her to say it's not Ann, it's Annie. And Ann said that her brother James was the only person in the entire world that had ever called her Annie instead of Ann. Little James was also able to tell Ann that they had another sibling named Ruth. And as you can imagine, Ann was kind of shocked to see how much James knew about their family at such a young age. They'd never met before. And it's not like they lived in the same neighborhood or close by. They lived worlds apart. Little James knew that their sibling Ruth was 4 years older than Ann, and that Ann was 4 years older than James. James was also able to tell Ann about all sorts of things that they'd done together as kids and things about their parents. And he also knew certain memories that you would only be able to know if you had been there to experience them. And with all of these different things, Ann had no problem and no hesitation believing that little James was her brother, James Houston Jr. And after their call, Ann sent little James a painting that their mom had made of James when he was a baby. And when James got the picture, he called Ann and asked her if she still had the picture of herself that their mom had made that was just like his. Ann said that their mom had all of the kids' pictures painted in the same position, in the same pose, when they were all the same age. And that no one in the world would have known that besides her siblings. James was even able to tell Ann the name of the artist that had painted the pictures that she'd sent to him. There was no plausible way that little James would have known any of this stuff about a family and a life that he'd never met. And then we learned why little James had been convinced this whole time that he had flown and died in a Corsair airplane. Because when Ann sent James a package of family photos and some of James's old things, the very first picture that little James pulled out of the box was a picture of James Houston Jr. standing in front of a Corsair airplane. And Ann was able to tell little James's parents that the Corsair airplane was James Houston Jr.'s favorite airplane, and that a Corsair was what he loved to fly the most. So it would make sense for him to think that he would have been flying a Corsair when he died on a plane when it was shot down and he was killed. And James's dad, Bruce, was able to find some other things that recorded an elite group of pilots that had been chosen to do a test flight with Corsair airplanes only about 8 months before James Houston Jr. was transferred to where his plane would later be shot down and he would be killed. So Bruce also found that there had only been 20 pilots chosen for this group, and that James Houston Jr. was one of them. And after Bruce found this missing piece about the Corsair airplane, he said that there wasn't anything left to deny, that now every single piece that had either been looked up and they had all been proven to be accurate, correct information. There was nothing else that he had that he could question. That he now believed that his son had lived a past life where he was James Houston Jr., and that little James came to them because his work on Earth wasn't done yet. And like, oh, that's so sweet, but get this. Remember those G.I. Joe characters that little James had given those older style names to? Turns out, those were all real people. Billy, Leon, and Walter had all served with James Houston Jr., and they were all friends. And later, there was a memorial set up for the Natama Bay and, everybody that served there. And they had like a gathering where everybody that was still alive that had served would come and get together and, meet up. And of course, little James had to be there. And just when little James's parents thought that nothing else that he said, or did could surprise them anymore, he was walking right up to these elderly men saying things like, "Hey, you're Bob Greenwald. How you been? How's that busted shoulder doing these days?" Now, I don't remember if that guy's name was actually Bob or, he probably didn't have a busted shoulder. But that's how I imagine this going, because he was walking right up to these guys that could have been his grandpa, and he already knew their names and stuff about them before they were ever introduced. And it was all things that he would have learned during the time that they'd served together. And after this reunion on the drive home, Andrea and Bruce could kind of tell that James was a little down in the dumps. He was a little sad. And when they asked him why he was so sad, James told his parents that he was sad because all of his friends were old now. I think little James was kind of expecting to go and meet up with all these guys that he'd served with, But he expected them to look like they did when he died as James Houston Jr., and instead, they're all old. It's been years. And as James got older, the memories never faded, and Bruce and Andrea planned a trip to Chichijima, where James Houston Jr. was killed, and they did like a really small memorial service for James Houston Jr., and the emotions that you can see on little James's face during this while it's being recorded is telling. You cannot fake those kinds of emotions. And after this memorial, the nightmare stopped, but the memories of his life and World War II never faded. And I may be thinking way too much into this, but if you can go find the clip of little James on the boat with his parents in the water where his boat was shot down and he's throwing the flowers over, when he starts crying, the way that he wipes his tears is like a grown man. Like, it's not like a kid would use his, forearm or wipe both of his eyes. I don't know. It just, the way that he looks, it looks like such a grown gesture. It's so weird. And then there's an interview with James as when he's older, maybe 20 years old or so. And he looks just like James Houston Jr. I swear he does. So that's all I have this week. I'm really sorry this is such a short case. I did not have any time to research anything. And if you have a story like this, or if your kid says stuff like this, please reach out to me anywhere. Facebook at Mama Murdered a Podcast, Instagram and Twitter at murdered_mama, or even shoot me an email at mamamurderedapodcast@gmail.com. That's mama, MOMMA. And I guess we can do this again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then. Y'all, I just went back to edit this, and I hear birds chirping in the background, the bulldozer at the neighbor's house next door, the guy cutting his grass 3 streets over. I do have a building I record in. I call it the She Shed Studio, but there are still people that live super close by me. So if you ever hear noise in the background, just know it's not actually me. It's got to be a neighbor, because I would legitimately murder someone in my house for messing with my audio. So just keep that in mind. The birds, I don't mind those. The bulldozer, I could have kicked his ass. And the old man cutting grass, he always cuts grass. They're so sweet. I just leave them and let them be. But I wanted to mention that because I know it gets super annoying. I'm with you. I hear you. That is my husband on our side-by-side. Either one of our side-by-sides or the kid's four-wheeler. We're going riding this weekend. Either way, he knows I'm about to cuss him out for that. All right, y'all. Seriously, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. Hopefully no bulldozers, and hopefully the hubby is at work. All right, y'all, bye.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.